Hello, this video will be talking about how to create a tokenizer in Python. What is a tokenizer? A tokenizer is something that takes a query, like what I have right here. It takes a query, which is just a string, and breaks it up into a bunch of smaller strings, a big list of strings, as well as some other data types that will be easier to process. For instance, this string here has extraneous white space. It's hard to identify things like what are the names of tables, like here, Pokedex or keywords, and separating things like the fact that here are three separate tokens. There is this 67.5, which is a float. They have a comma character and then a null object. And what they should be transformed into are a series of tokens like so. So keywords are each their own token, names are their own token, punctuation is its own token. And here, the string Charmander here is Charmander right here. More punctuation. Integers should be converted to Python integers. Floating point values should be Python floating point values, and so forth. And null should be converted to none. So what we want is a function that can convert a query, like here, into correct tokens. I'm going to walk you through my solution for how to solve this problem. You're welcome to use code like the code that I'm writing here in your own future projects. Okay, so how do we start? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a function called tokenize. All right, and what does this take? It takes in a query. And what does this do? It returns a list of tokens. So what I'm going to use is this function here is what I'm going to use from my project.py file. I'm going to import the file. I'm calling this is SQL_tokenizer. Make sure you don't call this file tokenizer. That's the name of a built-in library in Python, so make sure you name it something else. But so what I do is I'm going to import SQL_tokenizer, and I'm going to use this tokenize function. Now obviously this tokenize function is quite terrible at the start, but what we're going to do is we're going to build this into something bigger and better as we go on. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is, returning the empty list is not actually particularly useful. We need to turn a query into a list of tokens, but we're going to build that piece by piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say while we have a query, so this is basically saying while the string is not empty, we're going to do something. Now what are we going to do? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to print out what is the query that I'm working with. So I can do it something like so. And then I can also print out what is the token list. Now, in order for me to have tokens beforehand, I need to make an empty list that starts with tokens. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to return tokens. So this is what I want my project to do. The other thing I want to do is I want to check every time I'm going through this loop, I should be taking off parts of my query and adding it to the token list, making my query shorter. So how do I go about doing that? Well, I'm going to add in a little sanity check where I'm going to make a copy of the query. So I'm going to call it old query equals query. And then I'm going to check after I do stuff. So here is going to be, do stuff. After I do things, I'm going to check whether or not my query has actually gotten shorter. So how do I do that check? Well, I'm going to type if the length of my query is equal to the length of my old query, something has gone wrong. And I'm going to do is I'm going to raise an error, raise assertion error, and I'll say something like query didn't get shorter. So my promise is in my do stuff section, I'm going to always be making the query smaller. I'm going to be removing white space. I'm going to be popping off junk. I'm always going to be promising to make my query smaller. And if I don't, I should get an error. And then when this loop is finally done, query is now empty and all of my data is now in this token list. So to run this code, I'm going to say I want to tokenize my query that's up at the top of the file. So I'm going to save this and I'm going to run it. So Python 3 SQL tokenizer. And if I run it, it says, okay, here is my query in the beginning. It has the whole string. my tokens is an empty list, and then it immediately raises the assertion error because what? I didn't do anything to make query smaller yet. It's still the same length as old query, so I actually have to do things now. Now what do I need to do? Well, I can look at this query and see the first thing that I have to handle is the fact that this query starts with white space. Leading white space before statements doesn't ever mean anything, so what I can do is I can strip that away. Now how would I strip that away? Well, I would want to do something like if the first thing in my query, so query bracket 0, is in white space. Now how do I check if the first thing is a white space character like a space or a tab or a new line or any of that? Well, the easiest way to do that is there's this nice string module in Python, and I can say string dot white space. Now in order to use the string module, up at the top of my file I need to import string. And so then down here I can say if the first character in query is white space, I need to get rid of that white space. So what I'm going to say is remove leading white space. And this is going to be just a function that I'm going to use. And what am I going to pass in? I'm going to pass in a query, and just, it's not really necessary, but a lot of my remove functions will look very similar, so I'm going to keep the same pattern. I'm also going to pass in the token list. And what this function is going to do is it's going to return a shortened query. And then I can say continue to say, okay, I've shortened the query, start again at the loop, at the next loop, and repeat as we go on. So how do I write this remove leading whitespace function? Well, this is a function, so I'm going to define it up above, and it takes in a query and tokens. And this is supposed to take in a query and take away all the leading whitespace. So how do I do that? Well, for right now, I'm just going to pass on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write another function that will be useful as well, especially with other remove tasks that we're going to do. And what's this function going to do? This function will collect characters that match a particular criteria. So for instance, when I'm trying to figure out what part of my query is the leading whitespace, I'm going to write a function that will figure out, well, here is all of the leading whitespace in my query. So what am I going to call that? I'm going to call that collect characters. Now once again, these are just recommendations. What is this thing going to take? It's going to take a query, and it's going to take in a list of allowed characters. So here are all the characters that should be collected from the query. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to write a little loop. So I'm going to say, here are all the letters that I've collected so far. So letters is an empty list. And I'm going to say for letter in query, and then I'm going to say letters dot append the letter that I found. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to return all of my letters joined together. So I'm returning a string. So what this does is it basically goes through my query, appends all of the letters to this list, and then joins them together. However, the one thing that I skipped was the fact that this should collect characters as long as they're in the list of allowed characters. If they're not in the list of allowed characters, we should stop collecting letters at that point. So how do you collect until you find something bad? Well, the easiest way is you can say if the letter is not in allowed characters, if it's not in allowed characters, break. Stop your for loop. So what this does is it goes through each letter in your query, but if they're ever not in the allowed character, it breaks and stops. But otherwise, the OK letters, until you hit that breakpoint, just keep getting appended. And what this does is it returns a string, which is all the allowed characters. So for instance, we can do a quick test here. If I say print collect characters, and if my query is, I don't know, hello, Josh. And now what should be my allowed characters here? Well, let's collect all the lowercase letters. So the way that you do that is you string dot ASCII lowercase. And if we save and run this file, what this does is it collects the word hello, but it stops as soon as we hit this whitespace, as soon as we hit a non-lowercase letter. Okay, that was just an example. I can get rid of that now. But we can now use this function to write our remove leading whitespace. So what do we need to do for this remove leading whitespace? Well, the first thing is we can say, hey, the white space that we found is everything that we collect. So collect characters, we pass in query, and then we say, what are the things we're trying to capture here? Well, white space. So string dot white space. So this is the leading white space. This is a string that represents the leading white space. This is not stuff we actually care about. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to actually remove it from the query. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to use string slicing, which says, okay, I want the query string, but instead of starting at the first character, start after all of the white space. So this is the same query as before, except instead of starting at the very beginning, start after the white space is done. And I can just return this. So what this function does is it takes in a query in tokens, figures out how much white space there is, and then returns the query without that white space there. It doesn't actually ever touch tokens. So I'm going to save this file and run it and see what happens. So first off, our query looked like that. And then we removed the leading white space. Now, note there are two spaces here because that is spaces that I added here. If I wanted to, I could remove the spaces by using something like string formatting. So here, let's make sure that we don't have spaces on my query. And so now you can see that there's no more leading white space. However, we then loop again, and we can't, there's no more leading white space, so this doesn't trigger. But the problem is we have the problem of our string didn't get any shorter. Why? Because now the first character is this capital I. So we need to write some sort of remove function that removes words. What are words? Words are things that start with a letter or an underscore, and then they are followed by more letters, underscores, and numbers. These are things like keywords. These are also things like names. So let's write a rule that captures words. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, how do we know if we're working with a word? We can say if query bracket 0 is in. Now, what does it need to be in? Well, it can be either string dot ASCII letters. Now, these are uppercase or lowercase letters. But I can also start with an underscore. So if the query starts with an underscore or these letters, then I need to handle the remove word. So what does the remove words look like? Well, it actually looks a lot like removing white space, except here I'm going to say remove word. All right, and now I'm going to write a function that looks a lot like remove leading white space, but in this case, it's going to remove a word. Okay, so in this removing word, we can say instead of we're capturing a word instead of white space, we're going to collect characters from query. But now, what are the allowed characters? Well, it's not strings white space now. It's string ASCII letters. But we could also have the underscore character. And words can also have digits in them. So if you say string dot digits, this will match the numbers 0 through 9. All right, and this line's getting a bit long, so I'm just going to break it up here. Just lining everything up to be pretty. All right. So this collect characters will collect ASCII letters, underscores, and digits. When it finds something that doesn't fit that pattern, it will stop. And so what is our shortened query? Well, our shortened query is, once again, the length of the word instead. The other thing that we need to do is words, unlike white space, actually matter, and we need to add them to the token list. So when we've captured a word, we can say tokens.append word. So now if I save this code and run it over here, what we can see is, oh, now we're actually eating into this thing now. So we start with removing the white space. We remove the white space, then we captured the insert added to tokens, we captured the onto, and we keep going onto here. We captured Pokedex, we captured values, and then we broke. Why did we break? Well, what's the first letter of our query now? Now it's this open parentheses. Open parentheses is a token unto itself, so what we need to do is we need to add another little check to say, hey, if the first letter in query is in this string, if it's either an open parentheses or a closed parentheses, what do we need to do? Well, this is a token in and of itself, so I can say tokens.append the query. So that's great. And the other thing is we need to make query a little bit shorter. We need to remove that first character. So I'm going to say query is equal to query starting at 1 and going onwards. So skipping that first character. And then we can say that continue again. So now, if I run my code, it should capture those parentheses. And indeed it did. It captured the parentheses. And so we can see here that we've captured the parentheses. And now what's the first character? Now the first character is this open single quote. So we need to have, once again, a rule that captures that case as well. What do open single quotes denote? Well, these denote text. These denote strings. So I'm going to say if query bracket 0 is equal to the single quote, then I'm going to do a lot like what I did up here, and I'm going to write something like remove text. And let's get rid of that extra line. So what does remove text look like? Well, it's going to look, actually it won't look too much like remove word. We'll write it from scratch. Remove text query tokens. And so now what we need to do is we need to capture the string. So what is the first real character of the string? Well, it's not that single quote, really. The first letter in this string, so this string is single quote Charmander, single quote. The first letter is really the capital C. So what I'm going to do is for that first single quote, I'm going to remove it. So I'm going to say query, actually I can make a, just to be safe, I'm going to say assert query bracket 0 is equal to the single string. So I'm going to say the first thing better be a single quote. And then I can remove that by saying, query equals query 1 going onward. So now my query doesn't start with that single quote. And now what I want to do is I want to keep collecting letters until I find that closing quote. So how do I do that? Well, what sort of letters are allowed in strings? Really, all letters are. So using that collect while isn't nearly so useful. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to search my query for the next single quote. So how would I do that? Well, there's this nice method called find. So I'm going to say query dot find. I want to find the single quote. Look through my string until I find a single quote. And so then what is the actual text that I need to save? Well, so this query find returns the index of the first single quote that's in this string. So I'm going to say this is, my end quote index is equal to this. And now I'm going to find, I'm going to capture the part of the query that's the string that I'm trying to grab. So how do you do that? Well, you can say text is equal to query, and I'm going to use string slicing again. So I want to start from the beginning of the query because I already removed the starting quote. And I want to go till you get to the end quote index. And so this text is actually what I need to add to my token. So I can say tokens.append text. Great. The other thing that we need to do is we need to remove this text from the query. So I'm going to say query is equal to query. And I want to start not at the beginning of the string. I want to start after the quote is done. And however, this end quote index is now pointing, it's starting at that single quote. I don't need the single quote either. So I'm just going to skip the final single quote by adding 1 to this. And then I'm going to return query. So now what does this do? It removes the first single quote. It finds where the next single quote is. It saves the part of the query that's actually the text string. Here would be the Charmander, so capital C all the way to the R of Charmander. And then it adds that to our token list. And then the last thing it does is it says, hey, remove the entire string from query. So now it's pointing, in this case, at the space after the single quote for Charmander. So let's save this and see if it works. And so now, indeed, it captures the Charmander, and then it captures the white space, And now we're stuck with, what's our next character at the beginning of the query? It's a comma. So a comma is a lot like the parentheses. It's another symbol that's a token unto itself. So I'm just going to add comma to our big list of heroes punctuation characters. So if I save and run this again, now it says the first thing is this 45. So now we need to handle capturing numbers, so integers and floats. All right, so the goal is now we're going to capture integers and floats. We'll do them both at the same time. And so how do we know when we're working with a number? Well, the easiest way to tell when we're working with a number is if the first character in the query, so if query bracket 0 is in string.digits, if it starts with a number. If it starts with a number, we're going to say query is equal to remove number query tokens, and then continue. So just like the previous pattern, if we find the first thing is a number, remove the number. We'll worry about if it's an integer or float a little bit later. So now we need to write a function that handles removing numbers. So remove number takes in a query and takes in a tokens list. So how do we handle removing numbers? Well, let's just, for right now, what we're going to do is we need to determine whether or not the thing we're reading in is an integer, meaning it doesn't have a decimal point, or if it's a floating point number, meaning it has a floating point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say query equals, and I'm going to just assume we have this nice remove, if I could type correctly, remove integer function, which we don't yet, but let's pretend we do. And so what we do is we're going to remove an integer from the query. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, the first thing on our tokens list, this remove integer thing, adds the string that represents the integer to the tokens list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say tokens.pop. I'm going to remove the thing that we added to the token list, which presumably is an integer represented as a string. Because remove integer doesn't do any conversions. We'll do the conversion here. And then what we want to do is we want to add that string to the token list. However, we don't want to just add it as a string. We want to convert it to an integer, which we'll use the Python int function. And so we'll pass in this int string. And then the last thing we do is we return query. Okay, so what this thing will do is we assume remove integer, removes the integer from the query, and adds the string to the token list. And what we're doing here is we're popping off the last thing on the token list, and we're converting it to an integer and then putting it back on the token list. Now this won't work unless we have a function that does this remove integer. So let's add that function in. So define remove integer, takes in a query and takes in a tokens list. And now how should this work? Well, it actually works a whole lot like the white space and the word. We're going to have to collect a bunch of stuff. So what I'm going to say something like integer is equal to collect characters from query. And what is the rules for an integer? Well, it has to be digits. So I want to collect all the string dot digits. And then I want to return, actually the next thing I want to do is I want to add this to my tokens list. So tokens dot append integer. And really, you know what, I'm just going to call this int string to make it really clear. Collect characters is just collecting characters. It's not doing any sort of conversion. So I'm going to add that string to my tokens. And then I'm going to return query, but not just the whole query. I want to return the query after the length of this string. So this should return the query after the length of this string. So now we have all of the parts here. It's going to remove a number. It's going to remove this integer string, and it's going to convert it to an integer and add it to the token list. So now if we run this code, it actually can read in, say, the 45 here and add it. Now note, this isn't a string 45. This is actually the integer 45. However, we run into a problem. We hit this 67, and so it reads in the 67, and adds the 67 as an integer to the list, and then it hits the dot and then gets confused. So what we need to do is we need to make this remove number smarter. We need to make this remove number work with both integers as well as with floating points. So how do we do that? Well, all floating points start looking like an integer. There's the whole part of the number, and then there's an optional dot afterwards. If we run into an integer and then find a dot, we know it's not actually an integer, it's actually a floating point. So what I'm going to do here is put in a little check. If after we remove the integer, we can check whether or not the first thing is a dot. Is the next character after removing the integer a dot? If it is, then we need to be treating this thing that we're reading in actually like a floating point instead of an integer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, you know what? The whole part of this number is equal to whatever was added to the tokens list. So I'm just going to pop it off and save it here. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well, we know the beginning of the query is this dot, so we can just remove that dot so we don't have to worry about it anymore. So I'm going to say query equals query starting after the dot. And now the next thing I need is I need to get the fractional part of the number. So after the dot, there's more numbers. What do those numbers look like? Well, those numbers look a lot like an integer. It's just a series of digits. How do I collect an integer? Well, I can use this remove another integer function. And now what I can do is I could say, okay, what's on the top of the tokens list? Tokens.pop is actually the fractional part of the number. So if you had a number 4.5, this would give you the string 5. So I'm going to say the fractional string is equal to that. And so now I can actually build my number. My number is the whole part dot fractional part. So let's build that. So I'm going to say something like my float string is equal to the whole string plus the dot plus the fractional part. And now what I can do is I can add that to my tokens list. So tokens dot append. And now I don't want to append the string of the floating number. I want to convert that to a real floating point number. So I would say float. So using the float function to convert the float string to just be a floating point number. Okay? So that's all the stuff we need to do if we find a decimal point. If we don't find a decimal point, then we're just working with a normal integer, in which case we need to just pop it off and convert that to an integer. So this whole thing applies to if we find a decimal point, this is what happens if we don't, and then we always end by just returning the query. So if I save this and run it, I can see, oh look, we get all the way, we can read in the closing quote, and then we hit the semicolon right here. You know what the semicolon needs? Semicolon is just another punctuation character like the comma and the parentheses. I hit save here and run it. Oh, sorry, it's a minor mistake. I forgot to add the continue here. So every time you remove a punctuation, you restart the loop. And so now with that continue here, if we run it, now we get all the way to the end. We're able to fully tokenize our input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just comment out these kind of debugging lines so that the only thing right here that I'm going to print is say, hey, print the list of tokens that this query gets turned into. And it looks like so. I can also do the print correct tokens. So once again, the correct tokens is this list right here that I kind of put in manually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this. And now when I run it, sorry, forgot my closing quotes there. And so now when I run this, I can see that oh gosh, I'm almost done. So these things look almost identical except for what? Well, look at this. Here I'm saying I found the word null, but here the correct version should have this as none. We should be converting the word null to the Python none. Well, how do we do that? The easiest way to do that is to check for it in when we're removing words. So what do we do when we remove words? We remove words, we collect the word, and then we add that word to the tokens. What I'm going to put in here is just a little special check. So we're trying to handle the special case of how do we handle null? Now, null is captured just like all the other words, like insert, into, Pokedex. Null is just captured like another word. However, instead of adding null to the tokens, we should instead append the none, the Python none object. So how do we handle that? Well, it's real easy. If the word that we're working with happens to be equal to null, what we're going to do is we're going to say tokens.append a none. Otherwise, we can just append the word as it is. So now if we save this and we run it, we can see now that our tokenizer works perfectly for this input. It's able to break everything right where we want them and to convert numbers into the associated integer or float, as well as convert nulls into none. However, this tokenizer isn't entirely complete, and for this project and future projects may require you to add in functionality. For instance, we're not taking into account the fact that strings, which starts with a single quote and can have single quotes within them as long as they're escaped, are allowed. So you might have to add in the functionality for escaping strings. I also haven't added in the functionality for things like negative numbers. Numbers are allowed to have hyphens before them, and you need to take that into account, possibly for future projects as well. But at the very least, this is a good place for you to start.